we witness hateful acts that cause much pain and suffering. Focusing on these events can easily bring us to despair about the fate of mankind. Yet, for every sad story, there are many stories of inspirational goodness. In the next speech, our speaker will describe one such story that has played a large role in defining how she lives. Please welcome Yvette Chen.
Fellow Toastmasters and welcome guests, my parents have a bookshelf full of photo albums with family memories. As a child, I loved to flip through those photo albums and just learn about our family's past. In one of the photo albums, I came across some very interesting pictures, which I'll show you. It's a picture of me in the hospital. I appear to be very young. My face and body are scratched up, and my arm appears to be in a splint. My first recollection of seeing these pictures was when I was 7 or 8 years old. I asked my parents, "What happened? Is this me? Why am I in the hospital?" They responded that I was involved in a car accident when I was 3.5 years old. That's all they told me initially. As I grew older, I learned more details of the accident. I learned that the accident happened when my mother was trying to quickly change lanes at the intersection of two freeways. She was trying to get onto her desired freeway. As she was quickly making the change, her car was hit from the side. The back windshield shattered, and her car started to spin. I was asleep in the back seat at the time. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And when the car started to spin, I was projected out of the car and luckily landed in the island between the two freeways. I landed with my arm under my head. I was unconscious for a while in the hospital. When I awoke, I suffered from a broken collarbone, which was a minor injury that repaired itself. No other major injuries. I did have to relearn how to walk. Again, I was 3.5 years old at the time. By the time I was 4, I was back to normal and off to preschool. These details were shared with me through random questions as I was growing up, through my random curiosity. I would just ask my parents sporadically when questions came to my mind. I had no recollection of this accident or even being in the hospital. So to me, this story was just someone else's story, and I was a curious listener. One day in my early teens, I was in the car with my mother driving. We were on the freeway in some pretty bad traffic because there was an accident. To pass the time, I decided to ask my mother about my accident. I joked, "My accident probably caused a lot of traffic," and she nodded matter-of-factly. I asked her, how did she know where I was after the car started spinning? She became very quiet as she drew back into her memory, and she just started to tell me the story. She said she didn't know where I was. She couldn't describe the panic that she felt when she turned around and I wasn't there. She ran out of the car, frantically looking for me, and saw me lying in the island between the freeway. She said she ran to me. Other people had already gotten out of their cars and were calling for help. No one wanted to touch me because they didn't want to cause any more injury than I already had. All my mother could do was stand there and pray that I was okay. I could hear the pain in my mom's voice as she remembered this part of the story. And it was at that point that the story became real to me. As As I imagined the terror that my mother must have felt in that moment when she saw me, her baby, lying on the floor, not being able to hold me, not being able to tell whether I was even alive. The teenage me at that moment said cheerfully to my mother, "It's okay, Mom, I'm okay." She nodded and said she remembered that while she was standing there praying, other people had surrounded her and were just holding her and telling her that everything was going to be okay. My mother called those people that she remembered her angels. The story of my mother's angels had a profound effect on me. It redounded my perspective of how to live. These people were strangers to my family. To this day, we don't know who they were, but I'm so grateful that they were there for my mother so that she didn't have to be alone in that moment of horror. They didn't know anything about her. They didn't know her income. They didn't know her political views. All the things that often create barriers between people didn't matter. All they saw was someone in need. The idea that they could have just kept going, they could have just focused on getting out of that traffic to get on with their lives, always stuck with me. The fact that they stopped for my mother, it's just a huge thought to me, and it just affected everything that I thought about after hearing about their compassionate act for my mother. In today's world where there's so much suffering, the story of my mother's angels revealed to me how awful it must be for people who feel like they're alone in their suffering. The story of my mother's angels reminded me of the goodness in people and the compassion that's in all of us. It inspired me to live a compassionate life. So living a compassionate life, to me today, doesn't mean it only has to happen in the face of horrible accidents. Living a compassionate life to me today means stopping and being there for one another. It's recognizing that we are all fighting our own battles, whether it's illness, stress, insecurity, loneliness. What we can do for one another is just stop and be there. I've learned that it doesn't have to be big. It can just be a reassuring smile or an encouraging word. In Toastmasters, it can mean a kind suggestion instead of a blunt criticism. The point is to recognize and act with an understanding of other people's feelings, just like the people who helped my mother that day understood her pain. Fellow Toastmasters and welcome guests, we all have a choice of how to live our lives. In our daily hustle, it's easy to just focus on our immediate needs and our immediate circle. But I encourage all of us to stop and try to understand the people around us, people who we don't know. You'll find that we're all people just doing our best, hoping that everything will be okay. There, we will find the goodness and compassion that's in all of us. Back to you.